Jack Reacher had no particular destination, which meant anywhere could be the right place to get off the bus. The sign for Redwood Creek, Washington, had flickered past the grimy window, a simple wooden carving that promised little more than a name. The town was nestled in a deep green valley, choked with the kind of ancient trees that made the sky feel like a distant rumor. For a man with nothing but time, it was as good a place as any to stretch his legs. He pulled the cord, and the bus hissed to a stop at a crossroads with a single diner and a gas station. The air was clean and sharp, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Reacher took it in, a welcome change from the recycled air of the bus. He was a big man, built of hard angles and solid muscle that his simple clothes did little to conceal. He moved with an economy of motion that belied his size, a habit learned over 13 years in the Army's military police. He carried no luggage, just the clothes on his back and a foldable toothbrush in his pocket. He traveled light because he never planned to stay. The diner had a bell that jingled when he opened the door. It was a classic small-town spot, red vinyl booths, a long formica counter, and the smell of old coffee and frying bacon. A few loggers in plaid shirts and heavy boots sat at the counter, their conversations dropping to a murmur as Reacher entered. He felt their eyes on him, a familiar weight. He was an outsider, a variable in their predictable equation. He ignored them and took a stool at the far end of the counter. A waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that read Brenda slid a mug in front of him. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. "Please," Reacher said. "Black." She filled the mug from a glass pot that looked like it had been stewing for hours. It was hot and bitter, which was all Reacher required. He drank it slowly, letting the silence of the place settle. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was heavy, watchful. The loggers weren't just looking at him, they were assessing him, their gazes hard and unfriendly. Reacher had seen that look before in bars from Germany to Afghanistan. It was the look of men who owned a place and didn't like strangers rearranging the furniture. He finished his coffee and was about to ask for another when he noticed the community bulletin board by the door. It was covered in faded flyers for bake sales, lost cats, and tractor repairs. But one flyer, newer than the rest, stood out. It was a missing person notice. The picture showed a young man with a bright, inquisitive smile and dark hair. His name was David Chen. He'd been missing for 6 months. "Last seen near Redwood Creek National Forest," the text read. "Information wanted." 6 months was a long time. In a town this small, a missing person should be the biggest news in a decade. But the flyer was tacked in a corner, partially obscured by an ad for a local chainsaw sharpener. It felt less like a desperate plea and more like a forgotten obligation. Reacher gestured to the waitress. "Another coffee." When she came over with the pot, he nodded toward the board. "What happened to him?" Brenda's hand flinched, sloshing a little coffee onto the counter. She wiped it up with a rag, her movements suddenly jerky. "Who?" she asked, not looking at the board. "David Chen," Reacher said. "The missing man." Her eyes flickered toward the flyer and then away, as if it were hot to the touch. "He left," she said, her voice a little too quick. "Just packed up and left town." Reacher looked at the flyer again. It didn't say anything about him packing up. It said, "missing." "That's not what the poster says." "Posters can say anything," she muttered, moving away to refill the logger's cups. Reacher watched her go. She was scared, not just uncomfortable, but genuinely afraid. The loggers at the other end of the counter were now staring openly, their hands resting on the counter near their thick ceramic mugs. They weren't just curious anymore. They were hostile. He paid for his coffee with a few bills, leaving a generous tip, and walked out into the cool air. The feeling that something was wrong in Redwood Creek was no longer a quiet hum. It was a clear, ringing bell. A man goes missing, and the whole town pretends he just left. A waitress is terrified to even mention his name. Loggers look ready for a fight over a simple question. Reacher had no reason to get involved. He could walk to the crossroads and catch the next bus heading anywhere. It was the smart thing to do, the sensible thing. But Reacher had never been particularly good at doing the sensible thing, especially when he smelled a lie, and Redwood Creek reeked of it. The lie was as thick and suffocating as the forest that surrounded the town. He decided to stay, just for a day or two, just to see what a few more questions might shake loose. He started walking toward the center of the small town, a cluster of buildings down the main road. The first stop would be the sheriff's office. He wanted to know what the official story was, and he wanted to see if the sheriff was as scared as the waitress. The sheriff's office was a small brick building with a single squad car parked out front. The sign above the door was peeling. The man behind the desk was thick-set and middle-aged, with a florid face and a uniform that strained at the buttons. A nameplate identified him as Sheriff Brody. He looked up from his paperwork as Reacher came in, his expression souring. "Help you?" Brody asked. His tone made it clear he hoped the answer was no. "I'd like some information about a missing person," Reacher said, staying by the door. "David Chen." Brody's eyes narrowed. He leaned back in his creaking chair, steepling his fingers over his gut. "Who are you?" "Just a concerned citizen," Reacher said. It was his standard answer, vague enough to be true. "You're not from around here," Brody stated. It wasn't a question. Chen's case is closed. He moved on. People do that. His family put up a flyer that says he's missing. "The family's emotional," the sheriff said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "They don't want to accept their son took off without a word. Happens all the time. Kid gets tired of the quiet life, goes looking for something more exciting." "What was he doing here?" Reacher asked, his voice even. "Was he from Redwood Creek?" "No, some kind of writer, journalist he called himself, doing a story on the logging industry, the history of the town, something like that. Asked a lot of questions." Brody's eyes were hard. "Too many questions. Rubbed people the wrong way." "Is that a crime in this town?" The sheriff pushed his chair back and stood up, trying to use his height for intimidation. It didn't work. Reacher still had a good 4 inches on him and at least 50 pounds of muscle. "Look, mister, I don't know who you are, but this is a quiet town. We like it that way. Chen is gone. That's the end of it. I suggest you get on the next bus and find somewhere else to be a concerned citizen." The threat was veiled, but it was there. Reacher gave a slow nod. "Thanks for your time, Sheriff." He turned and left. The warning was clear. Drop it. The sheriff wasn't scared like the waitress. He was part of the lie, an enforcer of it. This wasn't just a town with a secret. It was a town under guard. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, a pickup truck, a big new model with a cane logging logo on the door, pulled up to the curb. 2 men got out. They were the same loggers from the diner. They moved to block his path, their expressions grim. "You didn't listen to the sheriff," the bigger of the two said. "He had a thick neck and hands like shovels. He told you to leave." "He suggested it," Reacher corrected him. "We're suggesting it again," the second man said, smaller but wiry and quick on his feet. More strongly. Reacher looked from one to the other. It was the classic small-town welcome wagon for people who didn't take a hint. An old, tired script. "I'm just enjoying the fresh air." "Your air's about to get real stale in a holding cell, or worse," the big one said, taking a step forward. Reacher didn't move back. He never moved back. "Who is Silas Kane?" he asked, looking at the logo on the truck. The question seemed to catch them off guard. The big man's face tightened. "Mr. Kane owns this town. He provides the jobs. He keeps things running smoothly. He doesn't like outsiders stirring up trouble." "And asking about a missing man is trouble?" "It is when the man isn't missing," the wiry one snarled, and he made his move. He threw a fast, clumsy punch aimed at Reacher's jaw. Reacher saw it coming from a mile away. He swayed his head back just enough for the fist to whistle past his face. Before the man could retract his arm, Reacher stepped in, his own movements a blur of efficiency. He drove the heel of his palm up under the man's nose. There was a wet crunch of cartilage. The man's eyes watered, and he staggered back, clutching his face. The big man roared and charged, arms wide to grapple. It was a mistake. Reacher pivoted, lowering his center of gravity. As the man barreled into him, Reacher drove an elbow into his solar plexus. The air left the big man in a single, explosive gasp. He folded in half, his face turning a shade of purple. Reacher didn't stop. He brought a knee up into the man's sagging face. Another crunch. The man collapsed onto the sidewalk like a felled tree, unconscious. The wiry one was still on his feet, blood streaming from his nose, but the fight had gone out of him. He looked from his partner on the ground to Reacher, his eyes wide with shock and fear. "I think I'll stay a while longer," Reacher said calmly. He walked away, leaving them on the sidewalk. He could feel the eyes of the town on him now, from behind the windows of the general store and the post office. The message had been sent, but he knew another one would be coming back. The next one wouldn't be from a couple of lumberjacks in a pickup truck. It would be from Silas Kane himself, and it would be a lot more serious. He needed a place to stay and a place to think. He saw a sign for a small motel on the edge of town and headed for it. As he walked, a young man in a deputy's uniform hurried out of the sheriff's office. He was little more than a kid with a nervous energy about him. "Sir, wait up," he called out. Reacher stopped and turned. The deputy slowed to a halt, catching his breath. His name tag read, Evans. "I saw what you did," he said, his voice low. "Those guys, they work for Kane. They're his personal bullies." "So I gathered," Reacher said. Evans glanced around nervously, as if the trees themselves were listening. "Look, I can't talk here. Brody will have my badge if he sees me with you. But about David Chen, the sheriff is lying. He wasn't just some writer. He was a real investigative reporter." Reacher waited, saying nothing. "He was looking into Kane logging," Evans whispered, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Specifically, their operations deep in the national forest. He thought they were into something illegal. He told me he was close to getting proof. Then he vanished." "Proof of what?" "He wouldn't say. He didn't want to put me at risk. He just said it was big and it was dangerous. He went into the woods one last time to get a final piece of evidence, and he never came back out." The deputy's face was pale. "They said it was a hiking accident, that he probably fell somewhere or got taken by a bear, but they barely searched. Brody called it off after 2 days." This was the first piece of solid information Reacher had gotten. A motive, a location. "Where did he go into the woods?" "The old North Ridge Trail," Evans said. "It's barely used anymore, about 5 miles out of town." He looked over his shoulder again. "I have to go, but listen, you be careful. Kane runs everything here. The sheriff, the town council, everything. If he thinks you're a threat, he won't send 2 lumberjacks next time." "I'll keep that in mind," Reacher said. The young deputy gave a curt nod and hurried away, disappearing back into the sheriff's office. Reacher watched him go. The kid was scared, but he had a conscience. A dangerous combination in a town like Redwood Creek. Reacher now had a destination. The North Ridge Trail. Chen had gone into the silent forest looking for a secret. He hadn't come back. Reacher figured it was time someone went in after him. Not to find Chen, necessarily. It was too late for that. But to find the secret he had died for. Reacher checked into the motel, paying cash for one night. The room was sparse and clean. He stood under a hot shower for 10 minutes, letting the water sluice away the grime of the bus ride. He had no change of clothes, but he could wash what he had in the sink later. For now, he had work to do. He bought a map of the area from the gas station, along with a bottle of water and a cheap but powerful flashlight. The North Ridge Trail was clearly marked, winding deep into the protected National Forest area, an area that, according to the map, was off-limits to any kind of commercial logging. He walked the 5 miles out of town, following a paved road that quickly turned to gravel. The forest grew thicker on either side, the air cooler. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the road. There were no other cars, no other people, just the sound of his footsteps and the whisper of the wind in the colossal trees. The trailhead was marked by a rotting wooden sign. The path itself was overgrown, choked with weeds and fallen branches. Deputy Evans was right. No one had used this trail in a long time. It was the perfect place to make someone disappear. Reacher moved into the woods with a practiced ease. He was comfortable in places like this. The army had taught him how to read the land, how to move silently, how to see things that others missed. The light was fading fast, so he switched on his flashlight, its beam cutting a clean white cone through the deepening gloom. He followed the faint impression of the trail for about a mile. He wasn't looking for a body. 6 months in the wilderness, the scavengers would have left nothing. He was looking for something out of place. A piece of equipment, a scrap of clothing, anything that didn't belong to the forest. He found it an hour later, well off the trail. It was a glint of metal half buried under a thick carpet of pine needles. He dug it out with his fingers. It was a small digital voice recorder, its casing cracked but not broken. He wiped the dirt from it and pressed the power button. Nothing. The battery was dead, but it was something. It was proof that Chen had been here, and that he'd been recording something. Reacher pocketed the device. He kept searching the area, his flashlight beam sweeping in methodical arcs. 10 yards from where he found the recorder, he saw it. A patch of earth that was slightly sunken, the soil darker and more disturbed than the ground around it. It was roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. He didn't need to dig. He knew what it was. A shallow grave, the final resting place of David Chen. The forest wasn't silent. It was holding its breath. Reacher stood over the spot for a long moment. He had his answer. Chen hadn't left town. He hadn't been the victim of an accident. He'd been murdered and buried here, deep in the woods, because he'd gotten too close to Silas Kane's secret. His mission had changed. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about justice. The kind of justice that didn't always happen in a courtroom. He made his way back to the road under the cover of darkness. He knew he was being watched now. Kane's people would know he'd fought off their first warning. They would know he hadn't left town. They would be looking for him. He had to assume they were everywhere. Instead of taking the main road back to the motel, he circled around, moving through the trees that bordered the town. From a ridge, he could see the lights of Redwood Creek below. It looked peaceful, idyllic. A perfect little town. But Reacher knew what lay beneath the surface. He saw the headlights of 2 large pickup trucks moving slowly along the road he had just been on, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. They were hunting for him. He smiled grimly. Let them hunt. He was better at this game than they were. He made it back to his motel room undetected. He locked the door and jammed a chair under the knob, a precaution that was second nature. He sat on the edge of the cheap bed and examined the voice recorder again. It was useless without power. The motel room had no chargers that would fit. He needed to find another way. His mind was working, assembling the pieces. Kane was running an illegal operation in the national forest, logging most likely. The kind of old-growth trees in that protected area would be worth a fortune on the black market. Chen found out, got proof on this recorder, and Kane had him killed and buried. The sheriff was on the payroll, ensuring no real investigation ever took place. The loggers were Kane's muscle, keeping the rest of the town quiet through fear. It was a neat, tidy little kingdom, and Reacher had just kicked the door in. A knock came at his door. Not a polite rap, but a heavy, authoritative thud. "Mr. Reacher, this is Sheriff Brody. Open up. We need to have a talk." Reacher didn't move. He looked at the door, then at the single window. The window led to a 2-story drop into a dark alley. Not ideal, but better than the alternative. "I know you're in there, Reacher," Brody's voice boomed. "We've got the place surrounded. Don't make this difficult." Reacher knew it wasn't a conversation Brody wanted. He'd brought backup, Kane's men. They weren't here to arrest him. They were here to finish what the 2 loggers had started, to make him disappear, just like David Chen. He moved silently to the window. He slid it open as quietly as he could. He could hear men moving outside his door, positioning themselves. He had seconds. He took the thin blanket from the bed, grabbed the recorder, and swung his legs out the window. He hung for a moment, his fingers gripping the sill, then let go. He landed hard in the alley, bending his knees to absorb the impact. A jolt went up his spine, but nothing was broken. He was in the shadows, behind the motel. He could hear shouting from the front as Brody and his men smashed the door to his room open. He didn't wait around. He melted into the darkness, moving swiftly and silently away from the motel. He was now a fugitive in a town that wanted him dead. He had no weapon, no allies he could trust completely, and a dead piece of electronics in his pocket. For most men, it would be a hopeless situation. For Reacher, it was just another Tuesday. His first priority was to get the recorder working. He needed to hear what Chen had died for. He thought of the town, a general store, a gas station, a library. The library might have a universal charger for public use. It was a long shot, but it was his only shot. He circled the town for hours, staying in the shadows, observing the movements of Kane's men. They were searching for him, their trucks cruising the streets, their flashlight beams slicing through the night. They were clumsy, loud, amateurs. The town library was a small, single-story building on a quiet side street. The lights were off, but a single security lamp cast a pale glow over the entrance. Reacher watched it for 20 minutes from across the street, hidden in a thicket of bushes. No patrols came by, no sign of a security guard. He crossed the street in a low crouch, staying in the darkest shadows. The lock on the back door was old and simple. He used the metal stay from his shirt collar. It took him less than 30 seconds. He slipped inside, closing the door gently behind him. The library was silent, filled with the faint, dusty smell of old paper. He used his flashlight sparingly, shielding the beam with his hand. He found a small office behind the main desk. On a cluttered table next to an old computer was a tangled mess of cables and chargers in a cardboard box. A lost and found. He sifted through them, his large fingers surprisingly nimble. He found what he was looking for, a universal USB charger with multiple heads. One of them fit the small port on the recorder. He plugged it into a wall socket and waited. A tiny red light on the recorder flickered to life. It was charging. He gave it 10 minutes, an eternity when you were waiting in the dark with an entire town hunting you. Finally, he unplugged it, hoping it had enough power. He pressed the play button. A man's voice, hushed and breathless, filled the small office. It was David Chen. The sound was distorted by the wind, but the words were clear. "Got it," Chen whispered. "I've got it all on video. They're not just logging. They're taking the giants, the old-growth redwoods, trees that are 1,000 years old. Kane has a whole operation here, deep in the protected zone. Falsified permits, ghost trucks. He's selling the wood to overseas buyers for millions. This is the proof. The coordinates, the video of the cutting. It's all here. I have to get this out. They saw me. I think they saw me." The recording ended abruptly with the sound of a snapping twig and a sudden sharp gasp. Then, silence. Reacher switched it off. So that was the secret. Not just illegal logging, but the desecration of a national treasure for profit. A crime that would bring federal attention, something Kane couldn't afford. Chen hadn't just been a threat to Kane's business. He had been a threat to his entire empire. Now Reacher had the proof, but the proof was useless if he was dead. He couldn't just walk to the state police. Kane's influence might extend that far, and Brody would report him the second he tried to leave town. He was trapped, which meant he had to end it here, tonight. He needed to find the logging site. The recorder had mentioned coordinates, but he hadn't heard them. He scrubbed back through the recording. The wind noise was bad. He listened again and again, concentrating, filtering out the static. There it was, faint but audible, a string of numbers. Chen must have been reading them from a GPS device. Reacher found an atlas in the library. He cross-referenced his gas station map with the detailed topographical map in the book. He plotted the coordinates. The site was about 10 miles further into the forest, in a valley so remote it was marked as inaccessible on most maps. That's where Kane's operation was. That's where his men would be. He needed a weapon and a plan. He left the library, the recorder safe in his pocket. He made his way to the town's small hardware store. The lock was even easier than the library's. He didn't take a gun. Guns were loud and messy. He preferred simpler tools. He took a heavy-duty machete, its blade long and perfectly weighted. He also took a coil of thin, high-tensile steel wire and a pair of leather work gloves. The plan was simple, primitive. He wasn't going to fight Cain's army. He was going to hunt them, on his own terms, in his own territory, the forest. He moved back into the woods, the machete in his hand feeling balanced and right. He ran now, a steady, ground-eating pace that he could maintain for hours. He followed the compass bearing he had memorized from the map, heading deeper into the black heart of the forest. The moon was a pale sliver, providing almost no light. It didn't matter. He could feel the path as much as see it. After 2 hours of running, he smelled it. The sharp, clean scent of freshly cut wood and the acrid smell of diesel fuel. He slowed his pace, moving from tree to tree, a ghost in the darkness. He heard the low rumble of a generator and saw a faint glow through the trees. He had found it. He crept to the edge of a ridge and looked down. The valley was a scene of industrial devastation. A huge clearing had been carved out of the forest. The stumps of giant redwoods, some 15 feet across, stood like ancient gravestones. Several massive logs were loaded onto flatbed trucks. A portable sawmill was set up under a tarp, and a handful of men were working under portable floodlights. There were about 10 of them in all, armed with rifles, guarding the operation. Silas Cain's private army. Reacher watched them for an hour, studying their movements, their patrol patterns, their numbers. They were confident, complacent. They didn't expect an attack here in their secret fortress. He started at the generator. It was their light and their power. He crept up behind it, silent as a shadow. The guard watching it was bored, leaning against a tree, smoking a cigarette. Reacher was on him before the man even knew he was there. A single, precise strike to the back of the neck. The man crumpled without a sound. Reacher used a short length of the wire to disable the generator's fuel line. He punctured it just enough to create a slow, steady leak. It would die on its own in about 20 minutes. Next, he targeted the patrols. He used the terrain, the darkness, and the noise of their own machinery to his advantage. He moved along the perimeter of the camp, a phantom predator. He took the first man with the wire from behind, a swift and silent garrote. He dragged the body into the deep shadows. The second he ambushed as the man rounded a large stack of lumber, a single devastating blow with the handle of the machete to the temple. 2 down. The generator sputtered and died, plunging the valley into near total darkness, broken only by the headlights of the trucks. There were shouts of confusion. The men were disoriented. Their fortress had become a trap. Reacher used the confusion to move faster. He was a force of nature in the dark, an avenging spirit. A man shouted, and Reacher brought him down with a flying tackle that broke his collarbone. Another raised his rifle, and Reacher threw the heavy machete with expert precision. It spun end over end, the blade catching the man in the thigh, severing an artery. The man screamed and went down. Panic erupted. The loggers were tough men, but they were not soldiers. They were being hunted by something they couldn't see. They started firing wildly into the darkness, their muzzle flashes giving away their positions. Reacher picked them off one by one. It was brutal, efficient, and impersonal. He was a force multiplier. One man acting with absolute precision and purpose against a disorganized mob. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. The survivors had thrown down their weapons, huddled together in the light of a single truck's headlamps. The only one left standing against him was Silas Cain himself. Cain had emerged from a small cabin on the edge of the clearing. He was an older man, but tall and powerfully built, with cold, calculating eyes. He held a large hunting rifle, but he wasn't pointing it at Reacher. He was looking at the chaos, at his defeated crew. "You," Cain said, his voice a low growl. He looked at Reacher, who now stood in the middle of the clearing, covered in dirt and sweat, the bloody machete back in his hand. "They told me you were one man. They didn't tell me you were this." "You killed David Chen," Reacher said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. "He was a pest," Cain sneered. "He was threatening my livelihood. This town's livelihood. These trees built Redwood Creek. They belong to us, not to some government committee in the city. They belong to everyone, Reacher said. You murdered him for money. Survival is expensive, Kane said, raising the rifle. And I am a survivor. He fired. The shot was deafening in the silent valley. But Reacher was no longer where he had been standing. He had moved the instant he saw Kane's finger tighten on the trigger. The bullet tore through the air where his chest had been. Reacher charged. He covered the 30 yards between them in a few seconds. Kane tried to chamber another round, but he was too slow. Reacher hit him like a freight train. The rifle went flying into the darkness. Kane was strong, and he fought back with a desperate ferocity. He threw a punch that Reacher blocked, the impact stinging his forearm. They wrestled in the dirt, two big men driven by different codes. Kane was fighting for his empire of greed. Reacher was fighting for a dead man he'd never met. It was a short, ugly fight. Reacher was stronger, faster, and more ruthless. He ended it with a series of precise, disabling blows. A palm strike to the throat to steal Kane's breath, an elbow to the ribs to crack them, and finally, a headbutt that knocked Kane senseless. Kane lay on the ground, gasping for air, broken. Reacher stood over him, breathing heavily. He picked up Kane's rifle. He could have ended it right there. Part of him wanted to. It would have been the simplest solution, but it wouldn't have been justice. It would have been a private execution. He heard a vehicle approaching. A single set of headlights bounced down the rough track into the valley. It was the sheriff's car, and behind it, another, and another. A convoy. Deputy Evans got out of the first car, his gun drawn but pointed at the ground. He looked at the scene, at the downed loggers and the defeated Kane, and then at Reacher, his eyes wide with awe. I called the state police, Evans said, his voice shaky but firm. When Brody took Kane's men to come after you at the motel, I knew I had to do something. I took the files on Chen's investigation from the evidence locker and I called them. I told them everything. Reacher looked at the young deputy and saw the fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by resolve. The kid had found his courage. Reacher ejected the magazine from Kane's rifle and threw the weapon to the ground. He then took the small voice recorder from his pocket and tossed it to Evans. This is for them, Reacher said. It's Chen's last report. It's everything you need. State troopers began to flood the clearing, securing the scene, cuffing Kane and his men. A senior officer approached Reacher, his expression a mixture of confusion and respect. Who are you? The officer asked. Reacher just shook his head. Passing through. He turned and walked away from the lights, away from the noise, away from the wreckage of Silas Kane's kingdom. No one tried to stop him. He melted back into the forest, following the track out of the valley. He walked the 10 miles back to town as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. Redwood Creek was quiet. The lie was broken. The silence had been filled with the sound of sirens. Justice of a sort was being served. Reacher walked straight to the bus stop at the crossroads. He didn't look back. He had a shirt that was torn and stained, bruises he would feel for a week, and a foldable toothbrush in his pocket. He had arrived with nothing, and he was leaving with nothing. The morning bus arrived, hissing to a stop. The driver opened the door. Where to? East, Reacher said, as far as this goes. He got on, took a seat at the back, and watched the silent forest of Redwood Creek disappear behind him. The town had a story to tell now, a story of a secret kept and a justice delivered. But it wasn't his story. He was just the man who had been passing through.